Hello, I'm Thane Kreiner, CEO of Marin Agricultural Land Trust. Thank you for joining us today for our inaugural episode of Our Common Ground. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and invite you, if you're not in Marin County, to find the land that you are on. I will put that in the chat for you here. So, MALT acknowledges that we are located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people of present-day Marin and southern Sonoma counties. We want to honor with gratitude the land itself and all of its ancestors, past, present, and emerging. And we want to think about how we can practice land stewardship in ways that are inclusive and regenerative for everyone. And that's really the framing of this set of conversations, Our Common Ground. We are hosting at MALT a series of conversations open to the public on a range of issues related to the future of agriculture and food. Our goal is really to surface solutions and ideas to some of the most pressing problems we face as humanity, and to unite a broad coalition of farmers, ranchers, environmentalists, and other community members in imagining a future state where we have sufficient and nourishing food for everyone, produced in ways that promote a healthy and diverse natural environment and provide everyone in the value chain dignified livelihoods. So our first topic today is really about carbon negative dairying, and much of Marin's agricultural land is used for beef and dairy cattle. Agriculture is also the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Marin County. Many ranchers and farmers are employing regenerative practices such as rotational grazing, carbon farming, and biogas digestion from waste from cattle. And what we want to explore today is whether it's possible to produce dairy in a way that is net zero or net negative in terms of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So with that, I'd like us to dive into the panelist introductions. And if we could start with you, please, Randy, that would be great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randy Black, and I work with University of California Cooperative Extension as the Area Dairy Advisor. And I get to help our dairymen with research and education in Sonoma, Marin, and Mendocino counties.
Thank you, Randy. Let's go to you, please, Lottie.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the MALT's Director of Science and Regenerative Agriculture. Over the past 15 years, I have worked mostly in the Central Valley, helping dairies with issues that really help to reduce emissions, conservation tillage, anaerobic digesters, and running manure through the drip irrigation lines for the efficiency, reducing the impacts on groundwater, and to just reduce the overall impact of methane and nitrous oxide emissions.
Thanks, Lottie. Joseph.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Button, and I am the Sustainability Director at Strauss Family Creamery, a local dairy company that supplies from 12 local dairy farms in Marin and Sonoma County. And I help manage and oversee our corporate sustainability program at Strauss, but perhaps most pertinent to today's conversation, I'm also tasked with engaging our farmers in advancing sustainable organic dairy practices, including carbon neutral dairy goal across our entire network. So great to be here today.
Yeah, really glad to have you. Marjorie.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Wendt. I'm a chemical engineer, and I've been teaching classes at UC Berkeley that focus on sustainability and carbon management and climate solutions technologies. So right now I am working on a research project in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at Berkeley, where we're studying the economics and the process and optimizing it for making renewable natural gas from the anaerobic digestion of food and dairy waste, and taking advantage of federal and state policy incentives. And I have been a resident of Marin County for 20 plus years and have been a happy supporter of MALT for most of that time.
Thank you. We really appreciate all of our supporters. Jason.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Prappis, CEO and founder of Phyto. I'm a recent transplant to the area. I'm in Petaluma by way of Boston. And Phyto is all about trying to help farmers do more with less. We're focused on producing aquatic plant products that allow for on-farm feed production with really excellent nutritional characteristics. And we generate this material predominantly using animal waste as a feedstock. So excited to be here.
Great. Great to have all of you here today. So the format for the conversation today is about 35 minutes of moderated Q&A from me as serving as facilitator. And then we'll take any questions from the audience. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box at any time, and we'll see them. Just select panelist, host and panelist, and we'll keep track of those questions that you're raising. And then we'll do a quick wrap up at the end, right before the top of the hour. So I want to start with you, Marjorie, if we could. When we talk about carbon negative, what does that mean, and how do we think about the different greenhouse gases?
Sure. So you all probably know that greenhouse gases contribute to climate change. And to think about solving the problem of climate change, I like to use an analogy to the pandemic. So you've probably all seen two types of graphs. There are the new cases and the cumulative cases. And when the pandemic is over, we hope that we will see the new cases curve go to zero and the cumulative cases curve flatten out. So on the other hand, if we look at greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, we will not see the cumulative emissions curve flatten out. And that's because even if we reduce most emissions, there are still some emissions that are prohibitively difficult or costly to remove, for example, air travel. So to balance the remaining emissions, we have to remove some greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. Furthermore, unfortunately, we've emitted so many already that we have to remove enough to make the new emissions curve not just go to zero like in the pandemic, but to go below zero. So we talk about climate solutions that reduce emissions compared to what we're already doing, and those that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And the most prevalent greenhouse gases that we will talk about today are carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4. Each molecule contains one carbon atom. So what carbon negative means is if we follow the path of that one carbon atom through an entire process, it goes from the atmosphere to either the biosphere, like planting trees or sequestering carbon in the soil, or to the geosphere, where it could get buried or sequestered underground in the same type of geologic formations from which it likely originated when it was extracted as a fossil fuel that was burnt for energy. So the net effect is removing more carbon from the atmosphere than you emit in the process. And a super important part of our discussion today is that carbon dioxide and methane are not equal as greenhouse gases. So on a 20-year time scale, which is really pertinent for this discussion, methane emissions are more than 85 times worse than CO2 emissions. And as you probably know, agriculture and waste contribute significantly to methane emissions. And so carbon negative dairying presents a very important opportunity to make a big impact in climate change.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. So Joseph, you mentioned that at Strauss, across the different ranches that are already producing, you're implementing a lot of climate beneficial practices. How far are you from realizing the goal of being carbon negative? And can you tell us a little bit about some of the practices already in place at Strauss dairies?
Absolutely. So our goal is as follows. By 2023, we hope that the Strauss Organic Dairy Farm, Albert Strauss's farm, will be net carbon neutral at the dairy gate. And by the end of the decade, we hope that the rest of the dairies in our network will achieve the same goal. And right now at the Strauss Dairy Farm, we are about halfway there with one big ticket item remaining before we can achieve net carbon neutrality. And really, when you break it down, when you're getting into the weeds on the dairy farm, pun intended, there's four major items that you want to address. And the first one is dealing with methane. That is the big hot topic item. It's the biggest source of emissions, and it comes from two places. One is manure lagoons. And there's a variety of solutions out there to minimize, mitigate, decrease methane from manure lagoons. What we're narrowing in on is a small scale biodigester as a replicable solution for the dairy farms in our network and in this region at large. The other big methane emission source is enteric methane, or cow burps. This is actually the biggest source of methane on the majority of the farms in our network. And this can be reduced by up to 95% by a particular varietal of red seaweed, which is currently being trialed at the Strauss Dairy Farm, and we've proven that it works. So when you pair those two solutions together, you've dramatically reduced methane emissions on farm by over 90%. Now, on top of that, we're also working to decrease fossil fuels on farm through electrification of vehicles. But I think what's most exciting is when you're looking at an organic dairy farm and you have hundreds of acres of pasture land, what you're really looking at is a mature, available area to sequester atmospheric carbon into the soil. And so with remaining emissions that we see on farm, either from manure application in the fields or some emissions that aren't captured by the biodigester or through red seaweed, we're able to offset those with on-farm sequestration through a variety of carbon farming practices, which we are very proud have been supported and identified by our partners at MALT and Marin Carbon Project and all the local resource conservation districts. And so we really believe that once the red seaweed solution becomes available, you'll see the Strauss Dairy Farm becoming net carbon neutral in 2023. And it's a very important milestone because this is something that I think a lot of people in society, a lot of people in the food system have looked at and said, that's not possible. Dairy can't be a low climate solution. And what we're proving is that not only can it be, but it will be. And I think we're doing it in such a manner that it's beneficial for the farmer from an environmental standpoint and from an economic standpoint.
Really important points, Joseph. And I think one thing for people to take away is that all dairy is not the same, and that when we have the privilege to choose what we eat, we have a responsibility to understand where and how the food is produced, and lumping all dairy together doesn't make a lot of sense. So choosing milk and cream and butter and ice cream and other amazing organic dairy products that's produced in ways that's carbon neutral or ideally carbon negative would be in the best interest of the planet and the people. So you talked about a number of different practices that you guys are already using, the biogas digester, electrification of vehicles, carbon farming, et cetera. Randy, can you tell us a little bit about how those practices and technologies get funded, especially in a year like this one where ranchers and farmers are under severe economic pressure because of this historic drought? How do we get these practices more widely adopted? As Joseph said, they have both environmental and economic benefits. So what can we do to really accelerate the adoption there? Over to you, Randy.
Yeah, so I think funding is oftentimes one of the biggest kind of roadblocks for our farmers, because they don't have a lot of spare change lying around. And so, you know, they're investing in their animals and their facilities. So luckily, we have a lot of really great state programs that our dairy producers can apply for. And, you know, the few that I immediately think of are programs that a lot of our malted farms, Marin County farms, Sonoma County farms have applied for and been awarded. And so some of those include the Healthy Soils program that helps farmers put compost on pasture to help sequester that carbon into the grass, into the soil, planting trees, many different practices that they can do in this no cost share program. There's also a SWEET program that helps them both utilize water more efficiently, but also do that in a way that emits less carbon emissions. So they're doing things in both an environmentally friendly way and helping them have practices, particularly that are useful in drought times. We had a program that is currently not funded, but it's actually a partnership program with MALT CDFA, which is California Department of Food and Ag, and the Marin Resource Conservation District. And this was a project that was funded through the Alternative Manure Management Program to bring solids out of that manure pond, like Joseph stated, to get those solids that can be digested by methanogenic bacteria, and actually use that to make compost that we can bed our cows with, that we can put back on the pastures. And I think that brings it to another way that we can fund these projects, which is outside of our state funds. And that's through these incredible partnerships, through things like MALT, through the Marin RCD or Sonoma RCDs, and also through great partnerships like Fido with Jason, where we're finding really great cost benefit solutions that help these dairies produce foods on their farm, produce products on their farm like bedding, and they can get away from transporting these materials onto the farm. They produce it right there, and it's in a more environmentally friendly way. So I think partnerships and our state funding, putting those together at the right time, is really how we can support our farmers to actually implement these practices.
Super. Thank you, Randy. And I also just want to highlight that UC Extension did a phenomenal program in July that dives a lot deeper than we'll have time for today on some of these technologies and practices, including the red seaweed. We have a question that we'll get to about the nutritional properties. Thank you for that. But I'm going to put that YouTube video in the chat here just so y'all have access to that. Lottie, sir, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the use of rangeland in Marin County and the business model of dairies, and how could they support adopting some of these practices and technologies to become carbon neutral or ideally carbon negative?
Thank you, Thane. The business model, I think, is extremely important. We have the Stewardship Assistance Program that the Marine Agricultural Land Trust is using. Some of these partnerships are also very important, but ultimately it's how a dairy ends up making money long-term, how they become financially viable. The business model, for example, in the Central Valley is mostly based on commodity cheap milk. And that's really unsustainable long-term, regardless of all of the government programs. In Marin, where we're looking at more value-added milk and cheese and things like some of the products that Joseph has mentioned, I think we have a shot. Longer term, we're going to need to look at many years of applying compost to build healthy soils, to reduce the overall footprint. So I think there's going to be a lot of working together with the industry to look at some of these value-added products, develop new markets, get consumers to really appreciate and be able to value and pay more for the food and where it comes from, and fully carry the cost of the food we're consuming, so that some of the government entities don't always have to bear the cost of this externalized impact from dairying.
Great. Thank you, Lottie. So Jason, you're an entrepreneur. I have some of those entrepreneurial genes in my background. Can decarbonization be profitable?
Wow, a great question. So I think you have to kind of pick apart what we mean by both profitable and decarbonization to make sure we can pull both off simultaneously. So I mean, simply put, your profit's going to be dependent on your revenues minus your expenses. So you have to increase revenues at a pace that's greater than the expenses you had to increase to produce those revenues. So on a dairy farm, revenues are predominantly milk. And you can look at increasing the volume of milk that's produced, but if you have to buy more cows and and take care of more cows to produce that milk, then it's not necessarily increasing your profit. And then if you look at the expenses, they're really common patterns you see across farms, both in California and out of state. And number one cost is almost always feed cost. Typically over 50% of the cost of goods sold of milk is in the feed. Then you look at labor, which is both expensive and challenging to find labor that you can have do these actually quite sophisticated tasks and be trained and stick around on the farm. And that's a headache that we hear a lot about with farmers that we talk to. And then you look at things like the utilities of the farm, operating expenses, rent if they're not owned. And so these all kind of go into that denominator of expenses. So if you want to increase profits, you're going to, again, have to figure out ways of increasing that revenue without surpassing that increase by the expenses. So decarbonization, to kind of switch to the other side, Marjorie and Joseph both mentioned kind of some of the sources of emissions that are really common across different dairy farms: enteric emissions, waste management, and then you have the embodied energy and carbon related to the feed production and transport that is a big part of the carbon story outside of the farm gate. And just as an example, if you think about how many things we grow in California and how many acres are under cultivation, the largest crop under cultivation is actually alfalfa. It's also the largest water user in the state, and over 70% of it goes to cattle. So this is a very important market, and it has huge supply chains involved and all the implications on water and carbon and transport. And that's for a locally grown crop. If you look at soy that's coming from much further away, it gets more complicated. So if you wrap this all together, how could you increase revenues without increasing expenses? Hopefully you can decrease expenses and reduce emissions from the farm. You would really look for, and the most impactful way you could do this is substitute the feed for something that is grown locally, that is nutritionally superior, or at least meets the standards of your existing operations, where you can produce more higher quality milk with the same or less cows to drive those expenses down. And you would also want to reduce enteric emissions. So those are the areas we're really focused on, and we've had really exciting results in all of those areas thus far.
Great. Well, let's come back to that in a little bit and find out about the plant that's behind you. But Randy, could I ask you just to sort of walk us through the sources of emissions? Marjorie talked a little bit about them on a dairy farm, sort of from the beginning to the end, when you know, before you have the cow there, what the cow's doing, all the way through the cow, et cetera.
Yeah, so if we start with the cow, the cow's main source of emissions is going to be through belching, and I really want to make sure everybody on the call knows it's from burps, not farts. We see a lot of information
Important
about
distinction.
cows. They belch the manure or the methane, and that's from them actually digesting that feed using microbes in the rumen, which is their very large stomach. 4-chambered stomach. So they're going to emit that, which we call it enteric methane, and that is of course released. We can find great alternatives to reduce the emissions of those particular byproducts. So then, the cow makes her milk, and she's of course got waste. And so that waste is going to create the emissions from the manure. And the way that dairy typically deals with manure, and this is a great way to deal with manure in terms of water quality and keeping this contained, is in large ponds. However, that large pond creates an anaerobic environment. And anaerobic means there's no oxygen. And so when we take away oxygen, this is when we again have this very methane heavy, other bad emissions for our environment that are being produced. So now we've got essentially from the cow in the front end and from the back end. But again, we have tools that we can actually use to reduce what we're producing by making that environment anaerobic. So adding oxygen so that we're producing less emissions there. And then, of course, in order for the cow to produce that milk, she needs to be fed. That takes typically some kind of transportation, since Jason's correct. We do actually bring in most of our feed that isn't pasture or silage here in Marin County. But we also have transporting cows around. There's a lot of places where we're using fossil fuels to on a dairy farm. So cultivating our feed, moving cows in through pastures. A lot of this takes fuel in order to make a delicious product. So what are ways that we can reduce that? We have dairies that have installed solar, found ways to create a better source of fuel in order to operate that farm. I will say, I just want to also note that even though cows are emitters, they're also the consumers of a lot of byproducts that we don't even think about. A lot of our local dairies are eating okara, which is a byproduct from soy. They are eating brewers' grains or distillers' grains, which is from our beer and from our alcohol. And so they're also taking those byproducts that would typically emit emissions in perhaps a landfill and actually utilizing that in a very nutrient-dense way. So we've already kind of touched on it, but those are really our three main ways: is through the animal, through the manure that she produces, and of course, through the way that we manage those animals.
Yeah, thanks for that, Randy. That's great. So why don't we start, since we have a question already from an audience member on that, with the red seaweed reduction of enteric methane emissions. You guys are trying that at Strauss right now. Joseph, can you tell us a little bit about that? And the question we got is, does it affect the nutritional properties or the flavor of the milk or any other products? So tell us a little bit about what's going on with that trial and how we can reduce that while maintaining the delicious flavor of those products.
Sure, absolutely. And I have a good answer to both of those questions. But just to start, at the Strauss Dairy Farm, what they're doing in this trial is feeding a very, very small amount of red seaweed. It's less than 0.5% of the cow's daily diet. So when you're thinking about it, just think about as if you're salting your meal. It's a minute portion. And as we know, seaweed and other sources of sea plants like kelp, they're rich in minerals and other nutrients that the cows are already getting as supplements. So in some degree, the seaweed is just really replacing other things that a cow is already getting in their diet. So it's not really changing in any significant or even noticeable way the nutritional value of the milk. Does it impact the flavor? Well, that is a very key question, right? Because what we don't want to do is change the delicious flavor of Strauss Family Creamery milk and maybe give it a weird sea flavor. And we've been able to verify through this trial, and the UC Davis team who trialed this earlier in the year were also able to verify there was no impartation of an off flavor to the milk. And so, those are very good solution or very good answers, because what we've realized is that at this very small amount, less than 0.5%, in certain cows, we've seen an over 90% reduction in their enteric emissions. Now, what Albert Strauss, our founder and CEO, has always relayed to me is he said, when you're making these climate solutions, and I hope there's dairy farmers on the call today, he always emphasizes they have to be economically beneficial. There has to be a business case. We can't just develop a really costly climate solution, call it net zero and be good, because guess what? We won't see replicability of the solution. And so, what's the business case for red seaweed? It could potentially be expensive, but one, it's replacing certain mineral supplements. Two, there's some evidence, and I'm going to speak to it softly because I don't know if it's fully baked yet, but there's some evidence that this particular varietal of red seaweed increases the feed conversion efficiency of the animal, which means that when you're eating the red seaweed, you may not need to provide that cow with as much daily feed and still produce the same amount of milk, which inherently lowers the cost of production to the farmer. And another climate solution results in bringing less off-farm feed a climate source onto the farm. And so there's kind of a dual benefit there. And in addition to being a really cool natural solution, a lot of people have asked the question, well, this isn't natural. You know, cows don't eat seaweed. Well, what's interesting is when they first identified this solution in Australia, cows were literally on the beach eating the seaweed on the shoreline. So it's not completely abnormal. I guess in this case, if you had cows wandering on the beach, they may enjoy some seaweed here in Marin County.
Thanks for that. Yeah, near Mont Saint-Michel in France, lamb pre-salé is lamb that eats in the salt marshes, and so you know, animals do need salt for homeostasis. So, and they need the micronutrients as well. Let's turn to the other end of the cow and talk a little bit about waste management and some of the challenges there, Marjorie, and opportunities.
Sure. So let's call it opportunities.
Oops, there you are.
Yeah, I was saying let's call it opportunities. So if you think about a pile of decomposing waste, it is as it decomposes, it emits biogas, which contains both methane and carbon dioxide. And so there are some things that we can do with that to save or even make money. So first, if you just digest the waste anaerobically, as we've been talking about, you can collect the biogas and then combust it in an engine to produce electricity. So this is being done at the Giacomini Dairy and the Strauss Dairy using a covered lagoon that allows the biogas to accumulate sort of under a tarp, and some perforated pipes might collect the biogas and transport it to an engine on the farm that creates electricity. So this can lead to big reductions in the carbon footprint of the dairy, even though the combustion does release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere for a couple of reasons. So you're converting the much more potent methane to carbon dioxide. So the methane is not being emitted from the manure, but is being emitted as carbon dioxide after the methane is burned in the engine. And you're also avoiding using fossil fuels for that same amount of energy that you get from burning the biogas. So it's really a double win. And on top of that, the solid and liquid materials that are left behind in the anaerobic digestion process are useful as animal bedding. They can be used or sold as compost and fertilizer. So that kind of completes a circular flow of material. You can take the process a step further, which is what we're investigating at Berkeley, by converting the biogas to renewable natural gas. And this technology is being implemented in locations throughout California right now, and involves removing impurities, sulfides, and other compounds that accumulate in the gas, as well as the carbon dioxide portion, which is typically about 40% of the biogas, and leaving pure methane, which is completely swappable with fossil-derived natural gas. They're both just CH4, and it can be sold to the grid or used in vehicles if it's compressed to compressed natural gas. In addition, the carbon dioxide that you've separated out from the biogas can be sequestered underground for an even bigger win for the climate. So right now, multiple policy incentives, especially here in California, encourage making renewable natural gas from waste and sequestering carbon dioxide underground. And so in fact, the value of renewable natural gas produced from dairy waste can be 15 times or more that of fossil-derived natural gas that doesn't have these incentives attached to it. So this is a way of rewarding the huge emissions reductions that are possible in the process. And also in California, we have a new mandate for reducing methane emissions and not much current policy support. So potential future incentives limiting methane emissions could add on to the benefit of doing some kind of process, anaerobic digestion, to produce renewable natural gas. And so why aren't we all doing this now? So in our work, we estimate that there's maybe a 10 to 15% rate of return possible over a 30-year time scale, but this is after committing a large amount of upfront capital and land to the process in exchange for a return rate that is very uncertain given the uncertainty of these government incentives over a 30-year time frame. So I think it's particularly exciting to think about MALT's commitment to stewardship and the possibilities to potentially mitigate some of the risk through cooperative implementations or facilitating the logistics of obtaining these credits for any steps in this process. I think they're there to be taken, and you know, the incentives are meant to be used. So I think it's an exciting opportunity.
Thanks for that, Marjorie. A really important point about the upfront capital cost and how we can make these kinds of practices and technologies available to ranchers and farmers, especially when they're under severe economic stress as a result of the drought, which I hear has raised feed costs from, I think someone quoted 50% earlier to as much as 60 or even 65% on a business that's already relatively low margin, coming back to Jason's economic analysis for us. So you talked a little bit about compost coming out of this process, and compost is something I've heard a lot about since I started at MALT 6 months ago to the day today from Phyllis Faber, one of our founders. And Phyllis believes that we should mulch all of Marin and really scale up carbon farming. And Lottie, do you want to talk a little bit about the benefits of that, both from a environmental and economic perspective, and also some of these other practices that many farmers and ranchers in Marin County are already using, like rotational grazing? Lottie?
Yeah, composting is really beneficial for returning carbon to the soil. It's also relatively expensive. And the trick is being able to convert some of that manure through composting in a circular model, probably in combination with digesters and using effluent from digesters first. So we have to think about this in the context of Marin, which with relatively smaller dairies. So the average 350 cow dairy would look to right size the use of composting and other technologies that have an economic fit with the business model. We're also looking at rangeland cross fencing that could reduce the impacts of overgrazing, especially with the drought. As we drive through the landscape of Marin, the effects of the drought are pretty severe. But keeping in mind that maybe in a few months we might have torrential rain and runoff. So when we're thinking about carbon neutral or carbon negative, we have to think about how we manage the soil, how we over an extended period, not just thinking about the immediacy of the drought. There have been other opportunities to look at biochar. There are some producers who are combining compost and biochar and looking at those benefits. There are some who are strong believers in this. We need to really start to understand that through some of our collaborative efforts, and the MALT Labs, which is a kind of a collaboration of the Marine Agricultural Land Trust and working together with a group of scientists. We're going to be looking at some of these potential benefits and how they have an economic fit within the landscape of Marin.
Thanks, Lottie. So I want to find out, you talked about effluent from dairies, and I think we have the perfect person on the call, Jason, to talk about that. And let's find out about the duckweed, the lemna behind you, and this sort of transformation, if you will, of waste to food, and the relationship of that also to water use, which has been mentioned several times. Jason.
Yeah, thank you. So, we started at the foundation of what are the problems that dairy farmers are facing in the region. And again, feed, labor, utility costs, also reputation. People are starting to get concerned that the dairy industry is getting thrown into this light of being a major emitter. And these are food providers that also provide an essential service for most people that I know who are consuming these products. So, I think we wanted to figure out a tool or a set of tools that we could develop that would allow farmers to be the change agents in this climate story, where they can save money by decarbonizing, but that's really difficult. So we looked at the feed, we looked at the profile of different feeds, we looked at what's the largest ticket item on the feed ration, and it's typically protein. It's also typically the one that's coming in from the furthest away. So if you add the transport cost and the carbon, the embodied carbon in the transport of these proteins, a lot of organic soy, for instance, in California is coming from Turkey and India, over 40% of it. So it's a really complex and long supply chain. So if you could grow protein on farm or near farm, it'd be really exciting. The piece that we added to it that we think kind of really doubles the value proposition is that we grow our plants entirely on processed animal manure, and we put it through an anaerobic digester ourselves. I'm a big fan of that technology, and I think what Marjorie was describing is what we've seen. It's a really potentially compelling solution on its own. But if you want to do something with multiplying effects with the byproduct, the slurry that comes out of the digester, we can turn it into a really high-grade protein. So the plants behind me, which are not to scale, they're not that big, they're quite small. They are big in their protein content. So we've accomplished 38% crude protein. In some varieties, we've seen 20% and above carbohydrates. So those are big numbers. Those are numbers you usually have to pay a lot for. And we've done it by generating it on dairy farms from the waste from these cows. And then we've recently concluded a phase 1 trial monitoring the growth of heifers. We're now engaging in a milk trial to see on the taste and the composition of the milk. And so far, everything is looking very promising, but it's early stage. So we're really looking to learn from the community on how we can be the most helpful in profitably decarbonizing this industry.
Thanks. A quick question for you, Jason. I think the answer was implicit in what you said already, but one of the questions from our guest was thoughts on duckweed versus seaweed. So duckweed's primarily protein, whereas the seaweed is providing micronutrients and reducing enteric methane emissions. Is that right?
My take is I think they're both really exciting. I think they could be complementary. On one hand, I would estimate, and it's too early to say for sure, but I would estimate that Asparagopsis, the red seaweed, is probably going to be a more potent enteric emission reducer per pound of diet. So as Joseph described, you can give a very little bit and it can have a big reduction in the enteric emissions. We're on a different side of the spectrum of what we're really concerned with on the dairy, and that's how can we take the biggest dent out of the feed bill and the biggest dent out of that carbon footprint of the feed. We'd also love to accomplish enteric emissions, which we're seeing at higher inclusion rates of 10%, 15% of substitution. We see large reduction in enteric emissions, but they're just fundamentally different. I think you also have to look at the supply chain. It's going to be difficult to grow red seaweed on farms, but if you can harvest it and ship it in a responsible way, then it could have that really potent enteric emission effect without having to send tons, literally tons and tons to each farm. Whereas we want to generate tons and tons of feed on farm so that you don't have to ship all of that. So again, I think they could be really complementary.
Great. And a related question for you, Joseph. Are there successful examples outside of Strauss on the use of red seaweed? And another question from Paul Martin is, do we understand what the elements are in red seaweed that makes it work in terms of reducing enteric methane emissions?
Sure. So the active ingredient that's reducing the enteric emissions is called bromoform. And embedded in the seaweed, it's a really good natural solution. It's one of the things that we've looked at very carefully to make sure that it's not transferring into the milk or to the animal and causing any health effects. So UC Davis has done a lot of trials on the red seaweed, so I would look to them and look at their research, peer-reviewed research. There's a lot of extensive research being done on different varietals of seaweed in the Northeast, and you can look there, but specifically for Asparagopsis texiformis, the Australians have really been the leaders in this solution. their National Academy of Science, hopefully I got that name right, has been researching this solution. They're building a $90 million facility to produce it. And so they've really invested in that as a climate solution for their country. And there's a lot of research coming out of Australia. Great questions.
Super, thank you. So Marjorie, what are the technology solutions that you think are most promising to get to carbon negative dairying? You talked a little bit about those, and I want to pivot from there and then maybe do a round robin on how do we scale these solutions and what partnerships are going to be necessary to get Marin County to being carbon negative. So why don't we start with you, Marjorie, and then we'll do a quick round robin on that.
Sure. So one thing I wanted to talk about that has come up a little bit now is that when we're talking about the emissions, we've been focusing on the cow and the feed, but it's really important that we continue to draw an ever increasing circle around the whole system. And so when we're talking about importing feed from India or Turkey, there's a huge transportation cost that's built into that. Another thing that costs a lot of from a greenhouse gas emission point of view is fertilizing the land. So we haven't talked about that too much, but I know there was a question about the compost and Roundup in Marin. So most commercial fertilizers are based on ammonia, and ammonia goes through an industrial process, the Haber-Bosch process, invented by chemical engineers during World War II, I think. And it's so pervasive that if you take every nitrogen atom that's in your body in the form of protein, over 85% of those atoms have been through the factories that make ammonia fertilizer, because so much of what we eat has been fertilized. And I've also heard a statistic that we fertilize twice as much as necessary because it's so cheap to make, and people just, farmers will buy the fertilizer and just apply it at a high rate because they can. So I think I'm seeing a lot of businesses starting up around alternative ways to make fertilizer. I think that is potentially a big win for climate change in that second layer of emissions that are contributing indirectly. I think also anything that reduces the transportation, so transitioning to hydrogen and associated transportation, electric vehicles on site, as Joseph mentioned, happening at Strauss, using electricity to power the vehicles on the farm is a great way to reduce emissions. And so another technology, using the biofuel in fuel cells instead of in an internal combustion engine, is being done in, I'm sorry, Thane, I know you know the name of this company, this startup that's working in that field. I've forgotten their name.
Not coming to me at the moment, Marjorie.
Anyway, so there are a lot of promising technologies out there, and I think it's very important to consider the broader sphere. So you've probably heard of the cradle to gate and cradle to grave analysis of the system.
Yeah, thank you. Randy, from your perspective, UC has worked with lots of different organizations. How do we get these to scale, and what kind of partnerships do we need to really take some of these ideas and get them used more broadly here, and with Marin kind of as a model for a future of sustainable, regenerative, climate-friendly kinds of food, including dairy?
So I think it's important that we remember that there isn't a one solution that fits all kind of package that we can just ask everyone, do this and this is going to be what works for you. Because not only does everyone have a different wallet, but everyone also has a different ability to manage different things, or really a way that they want to manage their farm. You know, we've got dairies that are being very efficient on less land and dairies that are being very efficient on a lot of land. So we have to remember that we need to find the right solution together for how they want to manage and their amount of land. And I think it's a partnership among a lot of different people. You know, the state has its own goal of carbon reductions over until 2040, right? So if they want to set this critical goal, then they need to put a little bit their money where their mouth is. And that's what they're doing with these state funded programs. And the same way, if we have processors who want to use this kind of marketing in order to get to these goals, that's another thing. We need to support our dairies and help them get there. But we also need to make sure that the cost-effective solutions are on the market for them to be able to invest in. You know, we don't want to push products on them that either don't work over a long period of time so they don't get that investment back, or that it takes so long that now they're out of business because they weren't able to get it back in time. And again, I think you said it earlier, Thane, I think the consumer needs to also put their money where they vote. And if you want to support dairy that has this mission of having healthy animals and a healthy food system, then you need to put your dollar there. If you have, I know it's a very privileged statement to say, but if you have that dollar available to spend where you have a choice, then make sure you spend it where people are really putting money into these solutions. And we have processors that are supporting those solutions, and we have dairy farmers that are truly invested in them.
Thank you. That was terrific response, Randy. Appreciate it. Jason, I want to turn to you now. That there's a really interesting comment here that I think is right on target about the expense of these technologies up front, and how do we manage that, especially for smaller ranches and dairies that we're lucky to have in Marin instead of large centralized feedlots. It's really what lends this landscape its magic is these family-run ranches and farms. So can you talk a little bit about, to the extent you're comfortable, about the business model for your organization, Fido, and how that would work for a farmer or rancher who had, let's say, 100 or 200 head of cattle?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we started with a lot of empathy for farmers and the fact that it's very difficult to buy new things, especially untested things. So what we didn't want to do was try to peddle our new technology and ask for a lot of money up front for it. So instead, we looked at, okay, how cost effectively can we make this material so that it retains really high quality? And what is the best way to sell that material to dairy farmers that haven't had a chance to try it yet because we're new? And the model that we came up with is that we sell them feed as a service that we produce on their farm for them. So that there is no upfront capital risk associated with a Fido farm. It's our risk. And we're exploring partnerships, including with MALT, that we're really excited about, where the financing of these farms is handled by an intermediary that can really offer low-cost capital that really catalyzes the adoption of these technologies. And in return, we can pay back the capital relatively quickly, on the order of 2-3 years is what we're shooting for, so that it actually just makes sense for everybody involved. The farmer gets to save money immediately by paying less for feed than they currently do, or cost competitively paying the same but having greater performance in the cow. And then the company, Fido, gets to keep its investors happy and maintain a growth trajectory by paying back our equipment by charging for these high quality feeds, but not higher than is kind of allowable for the budgets of the dairymen and dairywomen.
Oh, thanks. So in terms of the biogas digesters, I know you guys are using one with Fido that's from a social enterprise I actually had the opportunity to work with while I was at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, Sistema Via Bolsa, which is a lot less expensive and more tailored to small ranches and farms. So I think one of the things that we need to do is look at what are the technologies that are appropriate for the kind of ranching and farming that's happening in Marin County. Lottie, do you want to talk a little bit about what we as MALT can do to help smaller dairies access these technologies?
Yeah, the key, I think, is starting from the ground up and more fully understanding what it takes to operate a dairy. examples of like the Systema digester is a great example. Right sizing the technology for the application on the ground. Bringing all of these partnerships together, bringing in the innovation of Silicon Valley, which is just over the hill, to get some of these breakthrough technologies, I think is going to be really important. Bringing all of the partnerships together that we have here, Jason and the Phyto-Feed technology, and looking at water. I think water is going to be the key long-term for scaling technologies and really, taking us to the level. Water security, water infrastructure, with the lack of groundwater in the area and surface water, developing new surface sources of water. It could be creative as, looking at atmospheric water sources. It could be other types of technologies that we need to really get creative. And I think bringing all of this together would just really make a huge difference in setting the course longer term for marine and getting a carbon neutral situation here.
Thank you, Lottie. So we're just about out of time here, just 2 minutes. And I want to, start with or end with the question we started with, which is it possible for dairy to be carbon negative? And we're going to start with you, Joseph, since you've set a goal of being carbon neutral by 2023, which is really close on. So let's just do a really quick, less than 15 seconds. Is it possible? How long is it going to take? Joseph.
I've already said it. Yes, it's going to take no more than another year, but to get the whole region at scale, replicability, I believe that Marin County, Sonoma County, this milk shed within 10 years can be a global example of carbon neutral dairy farming.
Awesome. Marjorie, is it possible to get to carbon neutral or carbon negative dairy?
I agree within 10 years.
You're muted.
Oops. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I agree. I think within 10 years it's possible. I'll qualify that with saying if you're not looking at a huge picture, I think if you include the indirect emissions from transporting supplies to the farm and other indirect sources, I think it's a harder and more complex goal to achieve because it involves other players that we in Marin don't have as much control over. So I think that getting to carbon neutral also in Marin involves becoming more independent and fully using the resources that we have here locally.
Well, that's a great pivot to Jason and producing feed right on the farm. So Jason, do you believe it's possible for us to get to carbon negative dairying?
I would say maybe, and it's extremely important that we try, and that we try in a way that works with farmers and producers and doesn't just punish them for emissions, but really sees them as the change agents.
Great. Randy.
I kind of agree. I think it's possible, but as Marjorie said, I think sometimes things are a little bit out of our hands when we look at the pre and post supply chain. But I think also if you look at the progress that we've already made over the years, it shows us that we can get there as long as we support our dairy farmers in getting there.
Yeah. Lottie, last word to you.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. I think the technology already exists. I think the will simply has to be there because the lessons we learn, especially in marine, are going to be used to, across the world. I think we have the opportunity to solve this problem, this challenge in marine, and use those lessons not only on dairies, but on a whole lot of other ag industry operations.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our inaugural episode of Our Common Ground. I think we who have the privilege, as Randy said earlier, to choose what we eat, we have a responsibility to understand how our food is produced. And by having food produced locally, as Marjorie mentioned, and as all of us have talked about, and understanding, having a line of sight to where that food has come from is one of the avenues that we can work together, we can lock arms and take collective action to address these really important and pressing challenges of climate change. So thank you all to our wonderful panelists for joining us today. Thank you to our guests. This series will be available online and also rebroadcast on KWMR going forward. We hope you'll join us for upcoming episodes. Thank you again so much.